Berlin, the 6th of March 1944. 10 in the morning German time. A deep continuous metallic roar over the heart of the Third Reich. Hundreds of Merlin engines at 30,000 feet moving in formation above the capital of a country that had been promised 5 years earlier that no enemy aircraft would ever reach German soil. The man who had made that promise was Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe. He would later tell his interrogators that the sight of American long-range fighters over Berlin was the moment he understood Germany had lost the war. 600 miles to the west, in damp operations bunkers across southern England, thousands of American bomber crewmen were preparing for a mission many did not expect to survive. The fighters escorting them that morning belonged to a type of aircraft that 2 years earlier the Royal Air Force had officially classified as unfit for high-altitude combat. 6 words, typed on a British military form, filed, forgotten. This is the story of how an engineering mistake became the airplane that ended the air war over Europe. To understand it, you have to go back to 2 rooms. The first room was in Cambridgeshire, England, early 1942. A hangar at RAF Duxford in the flat Cambridgeshire countryside. Rain outside, the smell of engine oil and wet canvas. 2 officers from the Air Fighting Development Unit stood over a report they had just finished typing. The subject of the report was a new American fighter that had arrived in Britain a few months earlier. The verdict was polite. It was also devastating. Unfit for high-altitude combat. 6 words. And with those 6 words, one of the most aerodynamically advanced airframes ever produced by an American factory was quietly reassigned to tactical reconnaissance. It would fly low over the coast of France, taking photographs of German fortifications and armored columns, occasionally strafing a train, occasionally being shot down by ground fire. It would not fight where the real war was being decided. Above it, 25,000 feet above it. That was where the German bombers flew. That was where the Luftwaffe fighters climbed to meet the RAF. That was the sky that mattered. And the new American aircraft, praised for its speed at low altitude and its handling and its beautiful sculpted fuselage, could not reach it, could not fight there, could not survive there. The men who wrote the report were not being cruel. They were being accurate. And yet, 2 years later, that same airframe with one component changed would appear over Berlin in daylight and end the air war. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to the second room. Not to England, to California, Inglewood, California, April 1940. A cluster of low industrial buildings a few miles from the Pacific coast. Palm trees, concrete lots, the distant hum of aircraft engines being run up on test stands. This was the headquarters of North American Aviation, a company that in 1940 was known for exactly one thing: trainers. The 86 Texan, a single-engine 2-seat advanced trainer used to teach young pilots how to fly military aircraft before they moved on to real fighters. It was a good machine. It was not a fighter. Nobody in the aviation industry would have listed North American among the serious manufacturers of combat aircraft. Then the British walked in. The British Purchasing Commission had been sent to America with an urgent mission and a shrinking timeline. Britain was fighting for its life. The Germans had already conquered Poland. In the coming weeks, they would sweep through Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. The Royal Air Force was losing Spitfires and Hurricanes faster than British factories could build them. The Commission needed more fighters. Any fighters. Now. They came to Inglewood with a proposal that any rational company would have accepted without hesitation. Build the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk under license. The tooling existed. The design was proven. The engineering had already been done. All North American had to do was set up the production line and start delivering aircraft. Safe, obvious, sensible. The man sitting across the table from them did not want to build someone else's airplane. His name was James Howard Kindleberger. He was 45 years old. He was a tall man from Wheeling, West Virginia, who had trained as an engineer in the Army Signal Corps during the First World War. His nickname was Dutch. He was the president of North American Aviation, and he had a mind that ran forward faster than most rooms he sat in. He listened to the British proposal. He nodded politely. And then he made a counteroffer that should have ended the meeting. "Give us the same money. Give us the same schedule, and we will design a completely new fighter from the ground up better than the P-40, ready to fly in 120 days. The room went quiet. 120 days. For context, the Supermarine Spitfire, the aircraft that had just carried Britain through the summer of 1940, had taken nearly 4 years to move from initial concept to operational combat. 4 years of wind tunnel tests, prototype crashes, engine changes, wing redesigns. That was the normal timeline for a modern fighter. Kindleberger was proposing to compress that timeline by a factor of 12. The British should have walked out. They were desperate men, but they were not fools. They knew what they were being told was almost certainly impossible. They stayed. They stayed partly because Kindleberger was persuasive, in the way that certain kinds of American executives are persuasive. And they stayed partly because desperation had already carried them past the point where safe choices felt sufficient. Britain was burning. If some Californian trainer manufacturer wanted to bet his company on a 120-day miracle, maybe the miracle was worth the wait. They shook hands, and Kindleberger walked back into his own building and told a man named Edgar Schmued that he had just sold him. Edgar Schmued. He was 40 years old. He had been born on the 30th of December 1899 in a small town called Hornbach, in what was then the Kingdom of Bavaria. He had grown up around machines. His father had been a doctor with a fascination for early automobiles, and young Edgar had absorbed both the mathematics and the mechanical intuition of an engineer without ever attending a formal engineering school. He had no degree, he had no diploma, he had a mind and he had years of self-directed study, and he had spent most of his adult life proving that neither of those things required a piece of paper to be real. He had worked in Brazil during the 1920s. He had come to the United States in 1930. He had drifted through several American aviation companies before landing at North American in 1936. And by 1940 he had been quietly sketching a fighter of his own design in his spare hours, not because anyone had asked him to, but because he could not stop thinking about what a modern fighter should look like. When Kindleberger walked into his office in April of 1940 and told him about the British contract, Schmued was not surprised. He was not panicked. He had been ready for this conversation for years without knowing it. He assembled his team. Ed Horkey, 24 years old, a recent graduate of the California Institute of Technology, where he had specialized in aerodynamics. Horkey was the youngest man in the room, and he would be responsible for the most experimental component of the entire aircraft, the wing. But first they had to accept a constraint that would define everything that came after, the engine. The American government had told them, in the quiet institutional way such things are communicated, that they could not have the Rolls-Royce Merlin. The Merlin was British. Everyone that came off the production line at Derby was needed for Spitfires and Hurricanes and the desperate defense of the home islands. There was none to spare for a speculative American fighter. What North American could have was the Allison V1710. The Allison was an American engine. It was a liquid-cooled V12. It was reliable. It was in production. It produced around 1100 horsepower in the versions available to Schmued's team. And it had one fatal characteristic that would shape everything that followed. Its supercharger. The supercharger is the component of a piston engine that compresses the intake air before it enters the cylinders. At sea level, this is not particularly important. Air is thick at sea level. There is plenty of oxygen. An engine breathes easily. But climb into the thin air above 10,000 feet and above 15,000 and above 20, and the atmosphere itself becomes an enemy. There is less oxygen with every foot of altitude gained. Without an efficient supercharger to compress the thin air back to sea level density before it entered the cylinders, an aero engine simply ran out of breath. The Allison V1710 had a single-stage supercharger. Below 15,000 feet, it was competitive with anything in the world. Above 15,000 feet, its power fell off a cliff. And in 1940, the real air war was beginning to move above 15,000 feet. Kindleberger knew this. Schmued knew this. Every serious person in aviation knew this. They were being asked to design a modern fighter around an engine that would be tactically obsolete at exactly the altitude the fighter needed to fight. Most designers would have complained. Most designers would have gone back to the government and demanded a better engine. Most designers would have wasted 3 months writing memos. Shmuel did something different. He looked at the constraint, and he decided that if the engine could not give them more power at altitude, then everything else on the aircraft was going to have to give them more speed for the same power. Every square inch of the airframe was going to have to earn its place. The wing would have to slice through the air with less friction than any wing in production anywhere in the world. The fuselage would have to be sculpted, not built. Every joint sanded, every rivet filled, every panel smoothed. The cooling system, the ugly compromise that every liquid-cooled fighter had to carry somewhere on its body, would have to be reimagined from first principles. And here Shmuel reached for something he had been reading for years. A paper, published in August of 1935 by a British aeronautical engineer named Frederick Meredith at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. The paper was mathematical dry, largely ignored by working designers who considered it academic. It described what would happen if you placed the radiator of a liquid-cooled engine not in the nose, where every designer had been putting it since aviation began, but inside a carefully shaped duct on the belly of the aircraft. Air would enter the duct at flight speed. It would slow down. It would compress. It would absorb heat from the radiator. And then expanding as it heated, it would accelerate out the back of the duct at a speed slightly higher than the ambient airflow around the aircraft. Meredith had calculated in 1935 that under the right conditions, this heated exhaust jet would produce a small but measurable forward thrust. The cooling system, in other words, would help push the aircraft through the sky. Every major aircraft manufacturer in Europe and America had read the paper. Almost none of them had built anything around it. Some had tried and abandoned it. The engineering was demanding. The ducts had to be shaped with precision. The airflow inside the duct had to be modeled correctly. It was easier to keep putting the radiator in the nose where you knew it would work even if it cost you speed. Shmuel did not have the luxury of that shortcut. He had a weak engine. And so sitting in Inglewood in the spring of 1940, staring at a set of blank drawing sheets and a deadline of 120 days, he made the decision that would define everything. They would build the aircraft around a paper that most of the industry had shelved. They would build a wing that most of the industry considered impossible to manufacture. They would sand and polish and putty and rivet fill an airframe to a standard no American factory had ever attempted. They would take a bad engine and force the rest of the airplane to compensate for it. And in doing so, without knowing it, they would produce an airframe so aerodynamically clean, so hungry for power, that the moment someone gave it the right engine, it would rewrite the physics of the entire air war. But that moment was still 2 years away. First, they had 120 days, and a promise, and a hangar in Inglewood, with a Bavarian engineer at a drafting table sketching the shape of an airplane that did not yet exist. The clock started ticking on the 4th of May 1940. Kindleberger signed the contract. The British signed the contract. And inside a corner office in Inglewood, a Bavarian engineer with no diploma opened a fresh set of drafting sheets and began to draw. Edgar Shmuel did not sleep much that summer. He worked in a small room with a single window that looked out onto the flight line. He worked with a slide rule and a pencil and an eraser that he wore down to a stub by the end of the first week. He worked with Ed Horkey at the drafting board next to his, and with Raymond Rice, the vice president of engineering, coordinating the structural work, and with a rotating cast of draftsmen who filed in and out at all hours of the day and night. The lights in that corner of the building did not go off. The rules of the contract were clear. 120 days from signature to a rolled-out prototype. If they missed the deadline by a single day, the British could walk away, and the whole gamble was over. Shmuel did not miss. On the 9th of September 1940, 117 days after the letter of intent was signed, the doors of the North American Assembly hangar opened, and a small crowd of engineers pushed something out into the California sun. It was called the NA-73X. It was silver. It was slim. It was the sleekest fighter airframe any of them had ever seen. The fuselage tapered from nose to tail with a mathematical smoothness that seemed to have no wasted volume anywhere on its skin. Beneath its belly, aft of the cockpit, was a strange scoop-shaped intake, half recessed into the fuselage that no one outside the design team fully understood yet. And where the propeller should have been, there was nothing. The Allison engine had not arrived. The prototype sat in the sun for 18 days. 18 days of waiting. 18 days of watching Ed Horkey walk out to the ramp each morning and touch the wingskin the way a man touches something he is afraid might disappear. The airframe was ready, the engine was late, and the contract clock mercifully had already stopped at the moment the doors opened. They had built an aircraft. It had not yet flown. That would happen on the 26th of October 1940. A pilot named Vance Breeze climbed into the cockpit that morning. Breeze was a freelance test pilot, 41 years old, small and wiry, and famously calm in the air. He was not a company man. He had been hired because North American did not yet have a chief test pilot who could handle a maiden flight of this magnitude. Breeze belonged to no one. He was there to fly the airplane and tell them what it did. He started the Allison. He taxied out. He lined up on the runway at Mines Field, which today is Los Angeles International Airport, and he opened the throttle. The NA-73X lifted off after a short ground run and climbed away smoothly. Breeze stayed up for a few minutes. He tested the controls. He came back round, entered the pattern, and landed. He climbed down from the cockpit. The engineers gathered around him. What did he think? Breeze, who had flown almost every American fighter of the previous decade, said something that was carefully understated in the way test pilots often are. It flies well. That was the entire report. They had a fighter. 4 more flights followed over the next month. And then on the 20th of November 1940, a company test pilot named Paul Balfour took the prototype up for its 5th flight. Balfour was less experienced than Breeze. He was flying an aircraft he had never flown before in an airframe that was still being developed with fuel management procedures that had not been fully standardized. He ran out of fuel. The engine quit at altitude. Balfour tried to make a forced landing in a plowed field near the airport. The wheels sank into soft earth. The aircraft flipped onto its back. Balfour was hurt, but survived. The NA-73X was not so lucky. The prototype, the only one they had the physical embodiment of 117 days of work, was lying inverted in a California field, dirt packed into its cockpit, its beautiful sculpted fuselage crumpled at the tail. They picked it up. They repaired it. They flew it again. But the 5th flight incident cast a shadow that never quite lifted. The Mustang would be throughout its career an aircraft that punished pilots who forgot to manage their fuel. It rewarded skill. It did not forgive carelessness. Production aircraft began to roll off the Inglewood line in the spring of 1941. The first Mustangs bound for Britain crossed the Atlantic in the autumn of 1941. Aboard cargo ships crated and hoisted onto docks at Liverpool reassembled at Speke. Aerodrome tests flown by British pilots who wanted to see for themselves what the Americans had built. The reports were enthusiastic. At low altitude, the Mustang was faster than the Spitfire, faster than anything the RAF had. It rolled crisply. It handled beautifully. Its cockpit had better forward visibility than a Spitfire. Its range was extraordinary. British pilots stepped out of their first flights, grinning like men who had just discovered something they had not expected to find. Then they took it up to 20,000 feet. And the smile stopped. The Allison, competitive down low, simply ran out of breath in the thin high air. At combat altitude, the Mustang was slower than a Spitfire, slower than a Messerschmitt, slower than the aircraft it would have to fight. In January and February of 1942, the first Mustang is entered operational service with number 26 Squadron of the Royal Air Force, not as fighters, as Army Cooperation aircraft, tactical reconnaissance. They would fly low, they would take photographs. They would occasionally strafe a target of opportunity. They would come home if they were lucky. At the Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford, the formal evaluation was completed and typed up as the report that would sit in the RAF's files as the official verdict: unfit for high-altitude combat. The most aerodynamically advanced airframe ever produced in an American factory had just been reassigned to the tactical reconnaissance mission. The mission that, in every air force of every nation, was flown by the second-tier aircraft that could not cut it as pure fighters. The Mustang had failed. And nobody at North America, nobody in Britain, Nobody in the American Army Air Corps seemed to know what to do about it. That is the moment where most stories of failed aircraft end. The design gets shelved. The company writes off the loss. The engineers move on to the next project. And the aircraft becomes a footnote in the long list of interesting failures that populate the technical history of the Second World War. That is not what happened here. What happened was that a 33-year-old test pilot named Ronald William Harker walked out onto a hardstand at RAF Duxford on the 30th of April 1942 and climbed into the cockpit of a Mustang 1 for a 30-minute flight that would change everything. Ronnie Harker was not a famous man. He was not a decorated ace. He was not a senior officer. He was a technically literate, professionally quiet civilian test pilot on the staff of Rolls-Royce, employed to fly aircraft fitted with Rolls-Royce engines and write down what he observed. His job was accuracy. His job was honesty. His job was to tell his employer the truth about what an aircraft did not, what his employer wanted to hear. He was invited to Duxford by the Air Fighting Development Unit that afternoon as a courtesy. The AFDU had a Mustang 1 on the flight line. Would Mr. Harker like to try it? He would. He walked around it once. He noted the ventral scoop. He climbed into the cockpit. He fired the Allison. He was in the air for 30 minutes. For most of those 30 minutes, Harker was doing what any test pilot does on a first flight in an unfamiliar aircraft. He was learning it. He was feeling the balance. He was rolling it gently at first, then harder. He was pulling it into turns and watching how quickly the nose came around. He was letting the stick go and seeing if the aircraft flew straight by itself. He was pushing it into a dive and watching the airspeed climb, feeling how the controls tightened and stiffened at speed. He was in the language pilots use when they are being technical evaluating the airframe. And what he found astonished him. The airframe, he decided, was the finest he had ever flown. Not the fastest, not at that altitude, not with that engine. But the balance was perfect. The response was instantaneous. The nose tracked exactly where he pointed it. The controls harmonized in a way that made the aircraft feel like an extension of his own body. He rolled it, and it rolled the moment he asked. He turned it, and it turned without complaint or slack. He landed. He walked back to the operations building. And he did not write the report they were expecting. They were expecting a report on the Mustang's performance with the Allison. Harker wrote a report on the Mustang's performance with a different engine. He wrote that if the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, the newest two-stage, two-speed supercharged Merlin, that was then being fitted to the Spitfire Mark 9, could be installed in the Mustang airframe, the resulting aircraft would, in his estimation, be the finest fighter possessed by any Allied Air Force. He sent the report to Rolls-Royce headquarters at Derby. And then he waited. He had no reason to expect the report to survive. The Air Ministry was a bureaucracy. Bureaucracies do not like unsolicited suggestions from junior civilian test pilots. The Merlin was in desperate short supply. Every Merlin coming off the Derby production line was already spoken for by Spitfires, by Hurricanes, by Lancaster bombers. To divert Merlins to a re-engineering program for an American reconnaissance aircraft was to admit that the current allocation was wrong. Bureaucracies do not like admitting they are wrong. Harker's report should have been filed and forgotten. It landed instead on the desk of a man named Ray Dorey. Dorey was the chief test engineer at the Rolls-Royce experimental facility at Hucknall Aerodrome, 7 miles north of Nottingham. He read Harker's report. He agreed with it immediately. And he took it to Sir Wilfrid Freeman. Freeman was 54 years old. He was an Air Chief Marshal. He was by reputation one of the few senior officers in the entire Air Ministry, with both the technical literacy to evaluate what Harker and Dorey were proposing and the institutional courage to act on it quickly. Freeman said yes. In August of 1942, 4 months after Harker's flight, the Royal Air Force authorized the conversion of 5 Mustang airframes to Merlin power. The aircraft would be designated Mustang X. They would be modified at Hucknall by Rolls-Royce engineers at Rolls-Royce expense on the understanding that if the modification worked, the British would take the results to the Americans and demand a full production version. The initial resistance had not been technical. The initial resistance had been political and logistical. The Air Ministry had feared that diverting Merlins to a re-engineering program would reduce the number of engines available for Spitfires and Hurricanes, at a moment when Britain could not afford to reduce anything. Freeman overruled them. Work began at Hucknall in the summer of 1942. The Merlin 65, a slightly modified variant of the 61, would be the engine used. It was only 1 inch longer than the Allison it was replacing. 1 inch. In a design context where every fuselage is built around its specific engine, that near-perfect fit felt almost providential. The chin scoop had to be enlarged to accommodate the Merlin's larger carburetor intake. That was the visual signature that would distinguish the Merlin Mustang from the Allison version at a glance for the rest of the aircraft's life. A slightly deeper, slightly more aggressive scoop below the propeller spinner. Anyone who knew the airplane could tell you at 200 yards which engine was under the cowling. On the 13th of October 1942, the first Mustang X serial number, AL975, taxied out onto the runway at Hucknall. The pilot was Ronald Shepard, the chief test pilot of Rolls-Royce. Shepard advanced the throttle. The Merlin sang, and AL975 lifted off the runway at a speed that noticeably shortened the takeoff roll compared to the Allison version. Shepard climbed. He climbed past the altitude where the Allison Mustang would have begun to lose power. He kept climbing. He climbed past 20,000 feet, and the Merlin was still pulling strongly. He climbed past 25,000 feet, and the aircraft was still gaining speed. He kept going. When he came down, the flight data was almost embarrassing. The Mustang X had gained 51 miles per hour in top speed. Its rate of climb had nearly doubled. It could now climb to 20,000 feet in 5 minutes and 54 seconds, where the Allison version had needed over 9. Its service ceiling had jumped from around 22,000 feet to over 40,000. The airframe that had been declared unfit for high-altitude combat had just become the fastest, highest-flying, longest-ranged fighter in the Allied inventory. And when Ed Horkey and the Inglewood aerodynamicists began to compare the flight test data from Hucknall with their own wind tunnel numbers, they found something that made them stop and go back and check their calculations. The ventral radiator scoop was producing more thrust than Meredith's original equations had predicted it would. The theoretical maximum from a Meredith effect duct calculated on paper had a specific mathematical ceiling. The Mustang was measurably beating it. The reason took months to work out. It was a combination of factors. The specific shape of the North American duct, the way the boundary layer separated at the throat, the interaction between the exit flap and the aircraft's slipstream at high speed. In effect, the constraint of the weak Allison engine had forced Schmued's team to build a cooling system so aggressive, so aerodynamically optimized, so relentlessly refined against every square inch of drag that they had accidentally exceeded the theoretical performance of the underlying physics. They had built better than they knew. They had built better than Meredith had known was possible when he wrote the paper in 1935. Somewhere in Farnborough, an aging British scientist, reading the American test data, must have wondered briefly what would have happened if his own country had built around his equations first. But it was too late for that wondering. The Merlin Mustang was flying. The test data was already on its way across the Atlantic. And in Washington, on the desk of the Commanding General of the United States Army Air Forces, a folder of numbers was about to arrive that would change the industrial trajectory of the war. Washington, D.C., autumn of 1942. The folder from Hucknall crossed the Atlantic in a diplomatic pouch and landed on the desk of a 56-year-old career officer named Henry Harley Arnold. Hap Arnold, Commanding General of the United States Army Air Forces, the most powerful airman in America. A man who had earned his pilot's wings from the Wright brothers themselves in 1911, and who had spent the intervening 3 decades watching the airplane grow from a wooden novelty into the decisive weapon of the 20th century. Arnold read the report. He read the numbers. 441 miles per hour at high altitude. Service ceiling above 40,000 feet. Rate of climb nearly doubled, a range that no other single-engine fighter in the American inventory could approach. He did not wait for further testing. He did not commission a follow-up study. He did not send it to committee. He picked up the phone. He ordered 2,200 Mustangs powered by the Packard-built Merlin. Not 22 prototypes, not 100 for evaluation. 2,200 aircraft, a production order, placed on the strength of a British flight test report before the American engineering data had been fully compiled. It was the kind of decision that armies rarely make. It was the decision Arnold made anyway, because he had been waiting for this aircraft whether he had known it or not for 2 years. Every American fighter in Europe was too short-range, too slow, at altitude, too limited in the mission that mattered most. Arnold knew that mission. He had helped design the doctrine that depended on it. Strategic bombing of Germany. The B-17 and the B-24 flying in daylight in tight formations deep into the industrial heart of the Third Reich, bombing factories that produced tanks and aircraft and synthetic fuel. That was the doctrine. That was the theory of victory. And the theory had a fatal flaw that had been obvious since the summer of 1943. The bombers could not survive without fighter escort, and no American fighter had the range to escort them where they needed to go. On the 14th of October 1943, the 8th Air Force sent 291 B-17s against the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, deep inside Germany. It was the second raid on Schweinfurt in 3 months. The first had been costly, the second would be catastrophic. 60 B-17s were shot down. 600 American airmen killed, captured or missing in a single afternoon. The crews called it Black Thursday. Unescorted daylight bombing was suspended. The strategic air offensive against Germany, the campaign that was supposed to win the war from the sky, had ground to a halt because no fighter existed that could accompany the bombers all the way to the target and all the way home. The P-47 Thunderbolt could reach the German border and turn back. The P-38 Lightning could go a little further and struggled with engine reliability at altitude in the cold-soaked European winter. Neither was enough. The Luftwaffe knew exactly where the escorts had to turn back, and they timed their interceptions to hit the bombers 10 minutes after the fighters left. The bomber crews died, knowing when the fighters would abandon them. Then the Merlin Mustang arrived. The XP-51B, the American production version, powered by the Packard 516503, made its first flight on the 30th of November 1942. The pilot was Bob Chilton, North American's chief test pilot. Chilton took it up over the California desert and confirmed everything the British data had promised. 441 miles per hour at 29,800 feet. The fastest fighter in the Allied inventory, and it had only just begun. Production ramped up through 1943. North American opened a second plant in Dallas, Texas, built from bare ground during the war, specifically to increase Mustang output. An aircraft built in Dallas was identical to one built in Inglewood. Same tooling, same tolerances, same fit. A mechanic trained on a California Mustang could work on a Texas Mustang without a single new lesson. The engineering had come from a Bavarian without a diploma. The manufacturing came from an American industrial system that had learned to standardize precision at a scale no country in Europe could match. Then the fuel problem was solved. The Merlin Mustang was efficient. Its laminar flow wing produced less drag per mile than any comparable fighter, which meant it burned less fuel to cover the same distance. Its slim fuselage demanded less power to push through the air. The Meredith effect radiator recovered energy that other aircraft dumped into the sky as waste heat. The airframe was already by design a long-range machine. Then someone at North American did the math and realized that if you installed an additional fuel tank in the fuselage behind the pilot's seat, an 85-gallon tank that no previous fighter had carried, you could push the Mustang's range to something no one had contemplated. Berlin. Round trip. From England. The rear fuselage tank had a cost. When it was full, the aircraft's center of gravity shifted rearward far enough to make it dangerous in combat. It would pitch. It would porpoise. It could depart controlled flight in a hard turn. The standard operating procedure became fixed and unforgiving. Burn the fuselage tank down first. Do not engage in combat until it was empty. A pilot who forgot or who was jumped before he could finish burning it was in trouble that no amount of skill could always overcome. And then there were the drop tanks. Someone, and the exact name has never been reliably established, suggested making external tanks out of pressed paper and resin. Papier-mâché essentially, cheap, light, disposable. They would be dropped over enemy territory the moment combat began, and their fragility did not matter, because no one intended to reuse them. The paper tanks gave the Mustang another 600 miles of range. 600 miles of range from an object that cost a few dollars to manufacture and would be discarded the first time a German fighter appeared in the mirror. It was in retrospect the kind of solution that only a country not yet bled dry by 3 years of war could have manufactured in the millions. The first P-51Bs arrived in England in November of 1943 and were issued to the 354th Fighter Group at Boxted in Essex. Their first combat mission was a fighter sweep over France on the 1st of December. Their first deep penetration escort mission followed 12 days later on the 13th of December, escorting B-17S to Kiel, a combat radius of 490 miles, further than any American fighter had ever escorted a bomber before. The German fighter controllers, tracking the raid on their radar screens, waited for the moment the escort would break off. The escort did not break off. Somewhere in a bunker in occupied France, a controller stared at a radar plot and slowly understood that the American fighter formations he was watching were still there, still with the bombers, still deep inside contested airspace. The rules he had been operating under for 2 years had just stopped being rules. Then Doolittle arrived. James Harold Doolittle, 47 years old, Lieutenant General, the man who had led the carrier-launched raid on Tokyo in April of 1942 and become an American folk hero for 18 bombers no one had expected to see over Japan. He was a pilot. He was a doctor of aeronautical science from MIT. He was tactically imaginative in a way that made peacetime commanders nervous and wartime commanders indispensable. He took command of the 8th Air Force on the 6th of January 1944. He walked into headquarters, read the fighter tactics manual, and reversed the entire escort doctrine in a single stroke. Under the old rules, an American fighter pilot who spotted an enemy and began to chase him was required to break off the pursuit and return to the bombers if the chase carried him too far. The escort was the primary mission. Everything else was secondary. If a Luftwaffe pilot began to lose a dogfight, he could dive for the deck and know that the American fighter would let him go rather than abandon the formation. The prey had learned to survive the predator. Doolittle broke that rule. The fighters, he decided, were no longer bodyguards. They were hunters. If the Luftwaffe appeared, the Mustangs would engage. They would pursue. They would chase a diving German all the way to the ground if that was what it took. They would strafe airfields on the way home. They would find German aircraft and destroy them wherever they could be found. A single administrative decision. A change of paragraph in a tactical manual. The consequences broke the Luftwaffe. Between the 20th and the 25th of February 1944, the 8th Air Force fought what history has called Big Week, a sustained campaign of daylight strategic bombing combined with aggressive fighter escort against every major German aircraft factory the planners could reach. The Luftwaffe was forced to respond, forced to defend, forced to send its interceptors up to fight in the numbers the Americans could dictate. The Mustangs were waiting, and what happened over Germany during Big Week was not the destruction of the German aircraft industry, which recovered within weeks. It was something quieter and permanent and impossible for Germany to reverse. The German fighter force lost its experienced pilots. Germany could replace its aircraft. Dispersed factories moved underground, protected from bombing, kept the fighters flowing to operational units at a rate that surprised Allied intelligence right up until the final months of the war. What Germany could not replace at anything approaching the rate it was losing them was the veteran corps of its fighter pilot cadre. The men who had learned their trade in Spain, in Poland, in France, over the Channel in 1940, over Russia in 1941. Every dogfight cost the Luftwaffe a few of them. Every mission depleted the reservoir a little further. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe was sending 18-year-olds with 100 hours of flight training against American pilots, who had a year of combat experience and were flying the finest piston engine fighter in the world. The outcome was arithmetic. On the 6th of March 1944, 730 American bombers, escorted by Mustangs, of which some 660 reached the target area, struck Berlin in the first major daylight raid on the German capital. Berlin, in daylight, escorted by American fighters, that had flown 1,000 miles to get there. What Hermann Göring saw that morning is a matter that historians still debate. The famous quotation attributed to him that the sight of American long-range fighters over Berlin was the moment he knew Germany had lost the war comes down to us through post-war interrogations and the memoirs of men who spoke with him. The exact words are uncertain. The exact date is contested. Different sources place the remark on different days and in different rooms. The story may be composite, it may be reconstruction, it may be in the way certain moments in history become a truth that condensed into a quotation because it needed a form. What is not disputed is what could be seen from any window in Berlin that morning. Silver fighters over the capital. The promise made 5 years earlier that no enemy aircraft would ever reach German soil was flying overhead in numbers that could not be denied or explained away. By the end of 1944, 14 of the 8 Air Force's 15 fighter groups were flying Mustangs. The transition had been systematic and complete. P-47 groups were rotated out. P-38 groups were converted. The Mustang, an aircraft that had been declared unfit for high-altitude combat 2 years earlier, was now the standard escort fighter of the American air campaign. The bomber crews had a name for them, Little Friends. They said it on the radio when the Mustang slipped into formation deep over Germany. They said it in their diaries when they wrote about missions they had not expected to survive. They said it to each other in the mess halls at English airfields when a formation came home lighter than it had gone out, but lighter than it might have been. The Little Friends were here. The odds had just improved. There is one more thing that should be said before this story closes. The Merlin engine that powered the Mustang did not come only from Rolls-Royce. Roughly a third of every Merlin built during the war, some 55,000 engines came from a factory in Detroit. The Packard Motor Car Company, a manufacturer of luxury automobiles, had been licensed to build the Merlin in 1940. Packard tooled up an entire new facility building 81 dedicated solely to Merlin production. The first Packard Merlin came off the line at 6 in the morning on the 2nd of August 1941. When Rolls-Royce engineers examined the Packard-built engines, they found something that surprised them. By some accounts, the Detroit factory was holding tolerances at least as tight as Derby was, not looser, tighter. Packard had brought the manufacturing precision of American mass automobile production to an engine that had been designed by hand-built British craftsmanship. The result was an engine that was by measurable standards of dimensional accuracy comparable to, and by some accounts, slightly better than the original. Rolls-Royce had feared that Packard would degrade the Merlin in order to produce it at scale. Packard had instead matched it and in some measures improved it. The Mustang was at every level a hybrid of things that were not supposed to work together. An American airframe and a British engine, a Bavarian designer and a Detroit machinist, a weak initial power plant that forced an obsessive airframe, a rejected reconnaissance aircraft rescued by a 30-minute flight in Cambridgeshire, a theoretical paper from 1935 that produced more thrust than its author had thought possible, a bureaucratic reversal by an Air Chief Marshal who happened to trust his engineers, an immediate production order from an American general who did not need to be asked twice. Every link in the chain could have failed. None of them did. If Kindleberger had accepted the P-40 contract in April of 1940, the Mustang would never have been designed. If the American government had somehow found Merlins for it in 1940, Schmood would not have built the airframe around a weak engine. And the aerodynamic obsession that made the Mustang faster than physics predicted would never have emerged. If Harker had not been offered a 30-minute flight at Duxford in April of 1942, the airframe would have gone on flying reconnaissance until the end of the war. If Freeman had asked for another committee, if Arnold had ordered 100 aircraft instead of 2,200, if Doolittle had left the escort doctrine alone, the bombers over Germany might have kept dying in unescorted formations through 1944. The Mustang was not the product of a genius. It was the product of a specific unrepeatable convergence of talent-constrained chance and institutional courage. Every one of the men whose names have moved through this story was doing his own job as well as he could. None of them individually could have produced the aircraft that appeared over Berlin on the 6th of March 1944. Together, without ever fully knowing what they were doing, they built the airplane that ended the German air war. Edgar Schmued lived until 1985. He gave occasional lectures at aviation events in his later years, and he was careful always to give credit to everyone else. The team at Inglewood, Horkey and the aerodynamicists, the British technicians at Hucknall, the Packard machinists in Detroit, the NACA researchers whose wind tunnel data had made the laminar flow wing possible. He understood better than almost anyone that the aircraft was not his creation alone. It was the creation of a moment, a specific unrepeatable convergence that could not have been deliberately engineered, only recognized in retrospect for what it had been. An engineering mistake that was not a mistake, a compromise that was not a compromise, a chain of decisions that held every link all the way through, and a sound that carried through the thin cold air at 30,000 feet over Berlin in the spring of 1944, that told the men in the bombers below that they were not alone. The little friends had come.